Alright, this is gonna be a fun one. Maybe a little divisive too, maybe. Depends on which side of the argument you fall, but at any rate, my experience watching the live-action Yu Yu Hakusho was utterly fascinating, and given that I've recently watched through the entire live-action One Piece Netflix series too, these two productions combined have given me hope that we are on the cusp of a flood of genuinely faithful, compelling, and expertly produced adaptations to our favorite manga from the East. Now that's not to say that both of these shows are perfect, because trust me, they sure have their flaws, plenty of them, but I think what I've taken away from these adaptations is that they have a lot to learn from one another. Many of the aspects that Yu Yu Hakusho's live action came up short on, One Piece excelled in, and vice versa. And as a result, it's become clear to me that a genuinely excellent all-rounder adaptation is not only possible, but surely imminent. So, if you haven't already seen the live-action Yu Yu Hakusho or One Piece adaptations on Netflix, then I highly encourage you to do so before pushing forward with this video, as there will be tons of spoilers. However, if you don't care about spoilers or just don't like being told what to do, then great, because man, do I have a lot to talk about today. Yu Yu Hakusho, Episode 1. By the time I got done watching this episode, I was convinced I was watching something truly special. I even tweeted as much, citing that if this standard had been retained across the remainder of the series, then we could very well be looking at an all-time best in this subgenre. With any adaptation, the first question I think any creator, let alone fan, asks is, what approach is being taken here? This is a 5-episode series, and Yu Yu Hakusho is a story that famously takes a little while to get going. One Piece live action largely kept itself structurally faithful, instead truncating arcs to fit in 8 individual episodes with varying success. One glance at the poster makes it clear Yu Yu Hakusho is going to cover a lot of material across its short runtime. And as it turns out, the way it wants to do that is to combine plot points from across the series to tell its own version of events. The first 2 episodes flew by. They were the definition of all killer, no filler, and I mean that in the best possible way. But I think this will understandably give pause to anyone looking for a straight adaptation. Most everything that is skipped over or reformatted is done so in service of fitting the story into 5 episodes of runtime. Some good, some less so. The condensation of the manga's first arc, Kuwabara's everyone's introduction actually, is all pretty darn well done. We are delivered these characters' essence in an extremely timely manner. In the case of Kuwabara and Botan, the characters are written and acted to great effect, and really do feel like the manga characters brought to life. Some of this reformatting hits a little bit less well though, naturally. In an attempt to quickly showcase Yusuke's good side, he is shown ardently defending a bullied kid and taking the fall when authority figures show up mid-altercation. That in and of itself is not bad necessarily, but the show doesn't really do much to show us any of Yusuke's more delinquent personality, so it feels especially odd when any other character talks about him as such. Ultimately though, alongside these changes, there are still loads of one-to-one recreations and beats, like Yusuke getting hit by the car to save the kid, the funeral, etc. that all managed to hit the mark in spades. The most dramatic departure comes prior to Yusuke's revival in the second half, where it starts to pull from parts of the manga significantly later down the line. Normally when an adaptation tries to cobble together disparate moments to try and streamline the narrative, you get Avatar: The Last Airbender the movie. Despite taking elements from all over though, this initial episode doesn't fall victim to the same fate. Yusuke learns how to use the ray gun, Kuwabara is characterized through shared struggles with his classmates, Keiko has her pyromaniac moment, and of course, this whole segment is stitched together using the zombie trope that kicks off the chapter black material. In spite of all of this being woven together in such a short time frame, I actually think they managed to create a cohesive, character-focused story with kick-ass action that just felt right. There's certainly something to be said about the edge-of-your-seat uncertainty that comes with reimagined territory, but despite me being well aware of where the story ends up, you could have cut the tension with a knife with the climax of this first episode. And then we got to episode 2, and the epicness just kept on trucking. You've no doubt seen this Goki versus Yusuke fight do the rounds on social media since the show's launch, and it's for good reason in all honesty. The action in this show is far and away its strongest asset, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone familiar with the Rurouni Kenshin live action movies. The action director of its initial 3, a guy by the name of Takahito Ochi, is the very same director at the helm of the action here. I have no idea how this guy does it, but his masterfully choreographed work just feels larger than life in the best kind of way. It harkens back to those classic wuxia movies that have served as countless inspirations for anime action, so it wrapping back around here is honestly awesome. One Piece live action's action was pretty damn well choreographed too, but unfortunately I think where it stumbled for me was how the show was shot and edited. You can have the greatest choreographed action in the world, but if the cinematography is lacking, it's just not going to land in a convincing way. There's a saying in filmmaking that drama is shot in close-up, while comedy is shot in wide. A huge majority of One Piece was shot with extremely wide-angle lenses and natural light, with the camera often at an awkwardly framed distance. The speed and authenticity of it all seldom landed for me as a result, and I think it's interesting to look at Yu Yu Hakusho's in comparison to find some obvious ways to improve. This show was shot by Kosuke Yamada, who's probably most famously known for serving as the director of photography for Shin Godzilla. Having a premium DOP like that is a huge asset, and this guy knew how to frame this action to perfection. With camera lenses, there's something called focal length that effectively defines the field of view. Small focal lengths create huge wide angles that fit a lot in, but have a lot of distortion and are generally why you hate your phone selfies. A majority of films will go with high or medium focal lengths because it just results in a more professional and balanced looking frame. When studios do eventually use wide angle lengths, it's typically for effect, like a trippy drug sequence or a means to throw the viewer off kilter. One Piece's live action use wide angle effectively non-stop. The camera is constantly distorting faces or framing action with these huge sweeping angles. And I totally get the intent. Anime is chock full of this stuff, and I imagine the idea was to try to bring that to life. But I don't think the idea translated as well as many might have thought, and it ended up looking quite amateur at the worst of times. If you look at these phenomenally well shot Yu Yu Hakusho sequences, you can see all of this perfectly cinematic framing that knows when to go handheld, when to use crane and or dolly, and when to use a wide angle for momentary effect. It's a carefully considered piece with a tremendously well lit and color graded aesthetic to boot. Now don't get me wrong, this video isn't just going to be me singing Yu Yu Hakusho's praises while criticizing One Piece's. Both of these shows have tremendous production design. The practical sets were always going to be easier for a grounded show like Yu Yu Hakusho that has the whole real-life Tokyo to use, but even still, it was great to see that Koenma's palace was a built set, much like One Piece's Baratie was. Although I don't know if Koenma's green screen lookout quite sold me. Unfortunately, the conclusion to this wonderful episode left me with a feeling of unease. Suddenly introducing characters like Sakyo, Yukina, and Hiei in quick succession, and unfortunately, that jarring moment of fast-forward pacing establishes a trend and marks an end of the brilliance of these first 2 opening episodes. Episode 3, aka the worst episode. Alright. The action is great. You get the idea. Unfortunately, this episode is the series' low point, and it drastically hurts the potential of this series going forward. Adapting multiple pieces of vital story can be possible if carried out with the mission of being in service to the characterization and arcs in question. I mean, that's exactly what episodes 1 and even 2 did to a lesser extent. But from this point onwards, it felt as though the series cared less about meaningfully adapting segments in creative ways to heighten the characters, and instead just wanted to stuff in as many memorable scenes as they possibly could so that people could say, oh hey look, it's that thing from Yu Yu Hakusho. One Piece live action certainly made its fair share of cuts, some of which I wished weren't removed, like the action on the Baratie or how Mihawk showed up in the manga. But despite that, Netflix's One Piece remained remarkably consistent all throughout the season it was telling. While elements were cut, you could tell they weren't racing towards a specific conclusion, and offered plenty of opportunity for us to bond with the characters during intimate moments of reprieve. It understood that multiple seasons would be needed to tell the story properly, and if it didn't get to renew, then so be it. At least they honored the structure of the original story. Yu Yu Hakusho, by contrast, doesn't seem to care about or even want more seasons. reasons. Episode 3 is a hard cut to training with Genkai, introducing Toguro, throwing Dark Tournament plot points at the wall, and blending it all with Hiei's establishing beats too. All of that well-crafted combination of points from the first episodes flies out the window in favor of a vapid greatest hits montage. I don't hate the idea of introducing Hiei through the assault on Terukane's mansion, as it offers a speedy opportunity to establish Yukina and his attachment there. I don't hate the idea of blending aspects of the Dark Tournament into the Yukina rescue arc either necessarily. On paper, I can absolutely envision a world in which this works as a unique take on the Yu Yu Hakusho story. But in reality, it really just feels like shortcuts made out of a misguided foundational belief that a successful season 1 just had to cover the most popular part of the story. The most pivotal failing of episode 3 specifically, even beyond all of the other insanity crammed within it, is its handling of Genkai. She is introduced in episode 3, immediately giving Yusuke and Kuwabara with no real attachment, does very little in the way of actual training with them, and is then killed off, all within one episode. The entire episode completely neuters and annihilates any audience attachment to Genkai. Where she was a deeply important figure to Yusuke in the manga and anime, here she just feels like, well, some old lady that taught Yusuke to shoot the spirit gun better while Kuwabara beat a stick against a rock alone, and then she died. That alone is already very problematic, but the issues deepen and cascade out of control as we reach episodes 4 and 5 and begin to see how important Genkai actually was to this story. Episodes 4 and 5, aka Look How They Massacred My Boy. Fortunately, these episodes aren't a total wash, and I think it's important to highlight what they did very right before I weep into this microphone and fight a breakdown all over the things they did wrong. When it comes to live-action adaptations of comics and manga, I think there's often a temptation to remove all semblance of comedy and fun from the source, instead retooling it into a dark and gritty cinematic take, which, you know, honestly, sometimes that's a totally valid interpretation of the source if it has many versions of the characters like Batman and Superman do. But with manga and Yu Yu Hakusho especially, the source is the source, the characters are the characters, and their mix of serious and goofy is a pivotal and awesome part of the whole experience. This adaptation 100% gets that, and doesn't even remotely shy away from ensuring this shit is funny as hell. There's copious amounts of campy physical comedy, there's subtle little background bits of comedy that elevate character, and then there's just pure childish hilarity. This show genuinely had me laughing out loud multiple times, and it's so refreshing to see an adaptation stay true to its roots in this department. And perhaps somewhat divisively, one of the funnier elements comes from how the show actually departs from a faithful depiction of a certain character. The elder Toguro is far and away the biggest highlight in this final stretch. Kenichi Takito's portrayal of this character is beyond hysterical. He dials up the creepy campiness to 11 and commits like no other I've seen. Just the facial expressions alone are funny enough, but man, the staging of this character as it crawls along the walls like a madman had me roaring with laughter at times. It's such a total 180 of the manga's version that I probably should be upset, but the performance is way too hilariously unhinged for me to even care even a little at this point, particularly after so much had been changed already. Sadly, I wish I could say that the departures across the other characters worked for me quite as well. The advantages of Yu Yu Hakusho's realistic and grounded world, which allows brawls in the city streets of Japan rather than the fictional and demanding world of One Piece, really worked against characters like Hiei and Kurama in an ironic twist of fate. That sense of grounded identity this Yu Yu Hakusho adaptation possessed really clashed with their, very anime costuming and design. Hiei's design is certainly not one that's easy to translate convincingly into live action in the first place, but that difficulty is made all the worse as it clashes against the more pragmatic approach to the rest of the cast. Most characters look like they're wearing normal clothing, and here comes Hiei looking more like the live action embodiment of Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory album. And look, hey, it's a great album, but I wouldn't exactly be asking it for fashion tips. The same is doubly or maybe even quadruply true of Kurama, who is the most wig-wearing wig person to have ever wigged. It's all just, well, it's rough to look at and regrettably feels out of place in this production. And for the two most straightforward and stoic characters to look the most silly, it really clashes with the atmosphere their characters are trying to achieve, which isn't exactly something you want to say about characters that are meant to be central to the story. Now, a large component of what made One Piece's live action garner the goodwill it did across the online sphere was its dedication to telling the story we all loved. And finding the right actors to play the respective roles must have been an exceptionally difficult task. However, despite some of them being more rough around the edges than others on an acting front, the cast of One Piece didn't even need to stick 100% to the story of these early arcs to feel like the characters themselves. Emily Rudd felt like Nami. Makenyu felt like Zoro. Iñaki Godoy was Luffy. He was Luffy, seriously, what the hell? How did they find this guy? One Piece has some of the weirdest, most out there and tough to cast characters, but in the end, they all fell true to the entities they were portraying, which is a miracle if nothing else. I would say that as acting goes, Yu Yu Hakusho probably held a higher standard overall. Some of those early moments of Keiko and Yusuke's mother grieving were genuinely moving. And while they absolutely nailed the casting and characterization for the likes of Kuwabara and Botan, I couldn't help but feel like they missed the mark with the direction and script they gave to Takumi Kitamura's Yusuke Urameshi, the main character. While looking the part, and well, in some scenes with Kuwabara, they look honestly exactly like their manga counterparts to a creepy extent, Takumi's portrayal of Yusuke felt, quite one note. Yusuke in the anime and manga is quite the emotional kid. He's moody and aloof, yes, but he's also by his very nature extremely expressive and emotional. You can't go 2 pages in the manga without him whiplashing from emotion to emotion, wearing those feelings on his sleeve and face for all to see. Yusuke is brooding, goofy, curious, aloof, angry, happy, and everything in between. But live action Yusuke? Well, you know when your parents used to say that you shouldn't make goofy faces because one day you might pull one and you get stuck like that? Well, clearly this Yusuke made a very grumpy, uninterested face as a child that has been stuck like that ever since. It's honestly a real bummer because the team behind this show are clearly capable of writing characters full of life and range. Their characterization of Kuwabara alone proves that fact. Where Yusuke is only given this one face to make all show, Kuwabara is given the moon and back. Some scenes he's angry and brooding, swearing to take Yusuke down. Some he's sad and contemplative, thinking back on how he let his gang down in the first episode. And in others, he's delivering the best comedic moments of the entire adaptation. There is so much life in this character, and I wish some of that would have been imparted in, the main character. Okay, moving on. Unfortunately, I must now address the elephant in the room, because breaking news, these final 2 episodes make a sincere attempt to adapt the Dark Tournament across 2 hours. You heard me right, and by Dark Tournament, I mean literally just 3 fights and the final Toguro showdown. I'm serious. Well, the action remains as spectacular as it has been throughout the entire show, but the only issue is that it's all just so vapid. With no insight into Kurama's past, the battle against Karasu amounts to little more than a bizarre furry-eared spectacle. Hiei struggles with the Black Dragon don't exist, so the moment against Bui is just a big question mark. I mean, there's really not a story going on here anymore. It's more of a greatest hits montage that might look cool, but is completely devoid of the meaningful character work found in the source material. And well, CGI Max Power Toguro kinda deletes a lot of the goodwill I was giving to its visual front. These episodes really just leave me with a lingering question of, who is this actually written for? There are obviously only 2 types of people that can watch this adaptation. Those who have already seen or read Yu Yu Hakusho, and those who haven't. For existing fans of the story, so much is lost, confused, or poorly executed in this back half that, as I mentioned earlier in the video, it's hard to imagine longtime Yu Yu Hakusho faithfuls falling in love with this. So much of what is beloved about this story has been lost in hasty translation. Hell, the Dark Tournament, the series' most popular arc, has been reduced down to 3 fights and the big Toguro battle. The approach devolved from a thoughtful reimagining of an existing story to a story that is constantly tripping over its own feet in an attempt to rapidly cover every highlight it can think of. And that's not exactly enticing to longtime fans. And then there's the newcomers to the franchise. and I think they may honestly be in an even worse situation watching this. The back half operates at such a fast clip, zooming through characters and plot beats and moments at breakneck speeds, that I would honestly love to talk to someone whose first introduction to Yu Yu Hakusho was through this show. So many plot points, character introductions, and developments go unexplained that I can't imagine a newcomer watching this show and going, yeah, that all made sense. And ultimately, the final conflict stakes its emotional core heavily upon, you guessed it, Genkai. The crux of Yusuke vs. Toguro, the final fight of this series, lays its fulcrum upon the character that existed in this adaptation for about 7 minutes of runtime, with little to no reason for audience attachment. The actual fight itself is well choreographed, much like the rest of the show. The spectacle is there, but it is just hard to feel invested in its conflict when its components are so flimsy. So many pieces were in place for this adaptation: the action, set design, most of the CG, casting even. They were all top of their class compared to other live action anime adaptations. But it's for that reason that I am so bummed about how this story concluded. Netflix and Robot Communications assembled a crack team of master chefs, but asked them to create a food that is both breakfast, lunch, dinner, dessert, brunch, drink, and condiments all at the same time when it was 8 a.m. and all we needed was breakfast. One of the most critically and commercially panned anime adaptations to be released in recent memory has to be 2021's lackluster adaptation of Cowboy Bebop, produced by Tomorrow Studios. The production of that show produced stilted action sequences, awkward dialogue, and ultimately felt as though it entirely missed the point of what fans of the series loved about it so much. Films and TV shows are an enormous investment and risk for studios to support, perhaps now more than ever, which is why you've no doubt noticed an enormous surge in the amount of property-driven films and remakes produced over the last decade. I mean, why risk hundreds of millions on a film with an original idea when you can just remake something with a built-in fan base that, will support your investment through their shared love and curiosity? There's a reason that two of the highest grossing films released this year, Mario and Barbie, are both films headlined by the most popular and recognizable video game character and toy line on Earth. I mean, just look at the top 10 grossing films in history and you'll see it's littered with popular IPs that had themselves fan bases prior to their film's initial conception. This is all to say that we are far from done with this live action adaptation trend, and I would argue we are on the cusp of a truly fascinating renaissance of these older established anime stories. Remember when I mentioned Tomorrow Studio just a moment ago? The production team which was behind the likes of Cowboy Bebop's adaptation? Well, did you know that that very same studio produced another adaptation recently? And it was Netflix's One Piece live action. Okay, but how can this be? Why was there such an enormous difference in the final result? Well, in short, it believed in the story it was trying to tell, and that was all thanks to One Piece's showrunner, Steve Maeda, who not only respected the source material, but treasured it. I first noticed him as a creator when I was reviewing One Piece Blind back in 2020, and he started to follow me on Twitter. Through that, I noticed how he had followed other creators covering that story. And since then, it has come to light that he has recruited the help of many diehard fans and creators online to contribute in some small or large ways to the production. This is, of course, all to say that he was a genuine fan of One Piece. He valued what the fans valued, and that passion and respect for the story showed up in the final product. Through the production, through the casting, through everything. One Piece has an enormous fan base, far larger than that which Yu Yu Hakusho boasts, but I can't help but feel, had Yu Yu Hakusho been more patient, respected the source material a little more, and tried to tell one great story using the ingredients from the first season, we could have been looking at a new standard bearer. But alas, it fell short. One Piece live action was a massive commercial and critical success, one that captured the hearts of fans across the world. And although it didn't grab me to the extent it did with others, I think what it and Yu Yu Hakusho's adaptations have proven is that 100% success is possible. We are very much on the cusp of a brand new era of anime and manga adaptations. There will be for certain some growing pains, but I think if One Piece or Yu Yu Hakusho have demonstrated anything, it's that the ingredients are all there, and perhaps the future is brighter than many of us ever thought possible. Thanks for watching.